second one, autism. Thomas Berry talks about this one. Some of our early philosophy, Descartes gets shredded a lot, and some of it's with good reason. After him, the Earth was no longer seen as a living being, basically. As not that long ago, it really was, and again, I'll talk about that more next week. But the idea of dead matter, which was revolutionary at the time, has led to an awful lot of trouble. And so now, we no longer see anything else as alive. The DSM-4, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 4, defines autism as, this is it, I'm going to read it to you, a qualitative impairment in reciprocal social interaction, in verbal and nonverbal communication and imaginative activity, and markedly restricted repertoire of activities and interests. These traits can actually be readily observed in many adults of industrial society, especially when compared with those brought up in oral cultures, and especially if you think about it in relationship with non-humans, other than humans. Do we really have reciprocal social interaction? Do we have imaginative play? Do we have verbal and nonverbal communication? Okay, next one, addiction or compulsion. Chellis Glendinning has popularized this a lot. She's a very good writer. You'll enjoy her stuff. Dolores LaChapelle also talked about this a lot in her yummy, yummy books. One about Earth and Sexuality, which I think you'd really like, and I'm sorry I can't think of the title. But they're drawing on earlier philosophers, Louis Mumford and Jacques Ellul. And now these folks, the two ladies that I just mentioned, are ladies. Dolores LaChapelle, this power woman, Chellis Glendinning added, another power woman, added techno-addiction. It's the idea that behavior that continues in spite of the individual knowing it's absolutely destructive to the self, the family, their work, and their social relationships. We know we're harming the planet. We know it, and yet we do these things anyway. That is the very definition of an addiction or a compulsion. And it parallels spiritual teachings that acknowledge suffering as an inevitable dimension of human consciousness and desire at its roots. So all the mindfulness practices that you're learning in Buddhism should be effective in helping to change this sort of behavior, at least its power over us, and how many times it comes up. Techno-addiction characterizes industrial civilization. It is a compulsive craving for better machines, better, newer stuff. Oh my God, the iPad 2 is out! Okay, pervasive denial, like if we know darn well that these things are comprised of heavy metals and what kinds of sweatshops are being worked in order to bring them to us, and then what happens to them after they're gone, and by the way, I can't really afford it anyway, and I'm going into hawk, and that means I have to sell my life away in increments in order to have the blasted thing, and I'm staring at it all day anyway. No, I don't have one, but I want one. And the last thing is a blatant attraction to re-traumatization, which means you go through the whole cycle of wanting and getting it and realizing that, oh, I'm really not that excited about it after all, or now it led to all sorts of other consequences, and so, okay, well, maybe I'm over that one, but I still want the next thing, right? Okay, that's addiction or compulsion. Another one is narcissism. Narcissus was a Greek boy in a story and myth. By the way, the only difference between myth and history, according to the guru Joseph Campbell, is that myth is always true. So in this Greek myth, Narcissus was a young man who was very beautiful, and one day he happened to be washing himself in this pool, and the pool, there was no wind, and so the pool was very clear, and he saw himself, he saw a reflection of himself. He didn't realize it was a reflection of himself. He just saw this beautiful boy in the pool and fell completely in love. And from then on, he was pretty much useless. All he wanted to do was moon over this beautiful reflection in the pool. So narcissism It was applied now as a psychological term for obsessing over the the beauty of oneself. The thing is, even that is only seen dimly as through a reflection, right? And you've completely forgotten how to love others or engage in relationships. In other words, it's all about me. You can easily see how this applies to ecological issues. Okay, dissociation. This is one of Ralph Metzner's big ones. He was one of my professors. Interesting thinker. He was one of the 3 original Harvard boys. He, Ram Dass, and Timothy Leary were pals, if you can imagine what that time must have been like, all experimenting with LSD and all kinds of alternative stuff. And Metzner is really big on ecopsychological and transformative consciousness ideas. So, his idea here is that there are 2 cells. We have 2 cells, and we have them due to this ingrained belief that spirituality tends up and nature tends down. Again, I'll tell you more about where this came from next week, but you'll recognize this, that this is central to most church teachings, that, God is up and hell is down. And what that means in terms of ecological consciousness is that spirit is not only separated from nature, but it's also incompatible and opposed, right? It also means that lower are the earth, the body, passion, desire, sensuality, animals, women, all of these things, and they all need to be overcome, controlled, or conquered somehow by mind and repression, purifying, purity, and control. Paul Shepard says this is the central dogma of the West, this separation, and it's the one thing that we really have to get over. It's dangerous because to enter into divine realms, if you're living in this worldview, you have to work against your nature and to control it. And so, in my view, what this means is our noblest goals and ideals and visions of ourselves, our connection with the divine, our yearning of the soul, are associated with a sense of needing to overcome and separate from nature and from our body and from sexuality and many of the things that not only are the matrix of our life, but are really juicy and fun. And by the way, this is not a universal model for spirituality. And furthermore, it's okay to use these things to further our own desires. We forget that we're part of nature in the Earth's atmosphere, not on it. We are cells in her body. And you get it. Okay, another thing that isn't often talked about that is a causal factor, in my view, is the physical reality of simply having less space and too many people. Do you remember those experiments they did on rats, where they had that cage and they put a pair of rats in it, and it was a big cage, really nice, with everything they could possibly want in terms of physical comforts. I mean, good light, plentiful food, really nice bedding, fun things to climb on and chew. And they did great. They thrived, and they thrived so much, of course, that they bred more rats, and then more rats, and more rats, and rats. And that was the point, was that they studied the population as it grew to see if the rat culture would change. And basically, in the end there, they were absolutely nuts. All the rats went nuts, and they started attacking each other all the time, just because, even though they had everything they needed, it certainly wasn't competition over resources. They kept giving them more and more. Everything was plentiful, except enough space. Except solitude. And probably silence. So, I think that's a factor in our madness. The loss of darkness and silence, I think, are enormous, and they're not talked about.